So hopefully you've watched our webinar. I really introduced kind of some surface level concepts. I wanted to go into more of a deep dive into some of our assessments and really walk through some of our tech and how we do this. We're gonna start with the free stuff. So talked about the hip screen, gave you some tools really quickly. I first and foremost wanna show you the actual testing, how it can be done, and then I'm gonna dive a little bit deeper into, okay, this is really simplistic, it's very straightforward. Unfortunately, it is more complicated than I'm presenting, but I wanted to give something to come back to after our presentation in Nashville that you can then reference for the future. Again, we're gonna go into the hip screen. I'll talk about how you can just do the down and dirty version and then how that affects and kind of connect it to the swing, because I didn't do that in the webinar, but we likely will do that in the future. So Ryan, go ahead and lay on your back. You're going to start, and this doesn't have to be on a table, it can be on the floor, it doesn't really matter. We'll test hip external rotation, hip internal rotation. So internal rotation is where we're taking the foot away, and external is when we're going towards the center. The ranges we typically want to see is, and it varies, probably 40 or more degrees of external rotation. And as you can see for Ryan, he's pretty limited in internal rotation. And we want to see probably 20 to 30 degrees of internal rotation. Sometimes you see more or less depending on the age of the athlete. And we'll do that again. For him, he's a right-handed pitcher. I'll come back to this as far as kind of diving a little deeper as why we're seeing these changes, and then if we need to address those changes. So front leg, same thing. Internal rotation, you can see I'm taking his ankle away. See how it's a little bit more. External rotation. So laying on your back in the simplest way is just looking at what you have access to. So having limited range of motion can be a problem depending on who you are. And so we have to figure out, okay, do we need to improve that range of motion that he has on his right leg for internal, or is that just the way he is? Do we need to improve the control and the stability of that range of motion once we increase it? Again, this kind of the layered approach to this. Okay, first and foremost, we got to figure out, is this the way he was born and this is just how he is? And if we tried to improve range of motion, we would then start messing with the joints themselves, and we don't want to do that. It's going to cause problems down the road, or it's going to cause problems right away. So flip onto your stomach. Same exact test. We're going to go external rotation. So I'm taking his foot towards his body, and then we're going to go internal rotation. So he has, if this is 0, he has probably 30 to 40 degrees of external rotation on his right hip, and then maybe 10 to 20 degrees of internal rotation on his right hip. So flip back over real quick. So 30 to 40, 10 to 20. We can see here he has about 30 to 40 of external, but like less than 10 of internal. So we need to then figure out, okay, hey, again, is this just how he, with knowing now his back versus his stomach, there's a discrepancy in the amount of range of motion he has for internal rotation. Him being an older athlete, him having a lot of baseball under his belt, this is actually an adaptation that we see because of being a right-handed thrower and pitcher and hitter. So the reason we see this is over the course of time, our body will adapt to the stimulus that we're trying to get it to do. And so for a right-handed hitter, I'm always driving into external rotation at my back hip. Similar thing happens at the shoulder. So we tend to gain that. As we gain that range of motion, we're going to lose range of motion in the opposite direction, which is why we see less internal. Internal is when we go to load, sit, hinge, all the cues that you use for hitting. And so this can be problematic, and I'll go into why that would be the case. But because he has about 10 to 20 degrees of a difference, we need to likely improve this range of motion first through some mobility work. And then once he gains that range of motion, we need to then give him control of that, which is strength, stability, all the stuff that we do in the weight room. So as and then on our front side, you can see he's got a little bit more internal rotation. So go ahead and lay on your stomach one more time. Double check. We can see same thing, probably 10 to 20 degrees of internal rotation. And then maybe same thing, 30 to 40 degrees of external rotation. There is a little bit more to dive into that as far as looking our right and our left, but we expect on our front leg to have more internal rotation and less external rotation. There are times where we have the opposite of that, and I'll speak to as to why. But with our younger athletes, we tend to see more internal because we're driving into that. We're gaining that range of motion. And so that's why, again, we see that here. So the way he's presenting right now is probably the most common thing we see where athletes lack internal on the front. They have more internal on their back leg. On the front leg, they have more internal rotation. Their body is getting used to rotating from our right to our left. And so the bones literally morph and adapt to that over time, so we can make sure, or we can know that, hey, like this is how a right-handed pitcher or hitter is likely to present. Comparing them to their stomach tells us, hey, do we need to improve range of motion? Do we need to improve control? And so for him specifically, we need to improve range of motion. It's not going to be a ton. We need to get about 10 to 20 degrees. We're going to go through mobility work to do that, and likely do that daily. And then we're going to obviously try and improve the stability, the control of that range of motion in the weight room. So how would this affect, and we'll start with hitting because I've already started with hitting. We'll talk about pitching because he's more of a pitcher now. But from a right-handed hitter, if I lack hip internal rotation on my back hip, that amount basically gives me the amount of time that I'm going to be able to load into my back hip. Most common thing we see for our younger hitters is that lunging, the staying on my backside, getting to my front side too early. And the reason that happens is as they lose that internal rotation, they get to a position where their body says, all right, I'm ready to go. I'm in this optimal position. I'm ready to go forward. Second reason that happens is, or say they're going forward and they're getting there too early, coach says, you need to stay back. They said, okay, I need to stay back. Well, I can't get it from my hip. We're then going to go down to the knee. So instead of sitting and getting to that good hinge into my hip, I'm going to get, same thing we see on the pitching side, getting a little too quad dominant. And then when we get to that knee and we're getting a little more quad dominant, our knee, all that can do as we go forward is our knee can extend. It can't cause us to rotate. So we get the same compensation. I'm getting there too early. I'm not staying back. I'm lunging at the ball. And so you have to figure out, and this is where I think a lot of coaches are very good at, you can look at the swing or the throw and say, hey, here's the swing or mechanical compensation. Well, I'm going to give you a drill to work on sitting on your backside. I'm going to give you this and do that. And they can do it in the moment. They can do it in front toss or T-work or in the cages. But when they get into games, their body is going to do what is easiest, not optimal. And so for our hitters with our back hip, that's the most common thing that we see. Pitchers, when we have that internal rotation, as we sink and sit and get into our back hip, that's going into internal rotation. If we don't have a ton of this, we have two common compensations that happen here. Is either same thing, I go to my knee and start getting more quad dominant, knee dominant, which that's going to lead to the same outcome, almost pushing and jumping off the mountain, and I can't rotate my hips anymore. Or I start drifting and getting my hips, my center of mass, ahead of my back leg, and I can't utilize that back leg as well as I need to. I'm basically getting like drifting, getting ahead of myself. And we talk about this all the time, we want to hinge, we want to drift, we want all those things, but we need to do it in time with our upper half. So the amount of internal rotation we have on our backside is going to have a bigger effect from a pitching standpoint, a throwing standpoint, because if we don't have enough time to do it on our back hip, we're not going to have enough time to get our arm up and be on time there, and there's huge implications to that. So the back hip is where we typically start, and I know there's a lot to take away from this, but there's a lot of money to be made with this assessment, and then knowing, okay, here's how it's going to affect the swing and the throw. So next side, our front side. So he, as a right-handed hitter, we don't have a lot of hip internal rotation, or we have excessive amount of internal rotation, there's going to be problems there. Having more internal rotation on our front hip is super, super common. But if we know, and this is not the case for him, if we know our younger athletes, they lack strength of their lower half, as they go to have the strong front side, finish over their front side, decelerate, throw the brakes on, if that range of motion is excessive, they're not going to be strong enough to be able to stop themselves. And we know that, hey, we need stability from our lower half to then be able to have rotational power on our top half. And so we don't have stability here. If our pelvis is never stopping, then we're not going to get that, and it's going to have compensations and effects going up the kinetic chain. So it is more common to see more internal rotation on our front side, but we need to make sure that it's not excessive. So yeah, really straightforward. I think starting with comparing, laying on your back, figuring, okay, hey, here's what you have access to, and then laying on your stomach, here's what you are born with. If there's a discrepancy, we've got to figure, okay, do we need to mobilize and stretch and do some, I guess, exercises to attack that? And then we need to activate and stabilize. Or, hey, do we need to, are you somebody who, some of our younger athletes, you don't have a mobility issue, you have a stability issue. Your brain's not allowing you to get into these positions because you're too weak. We need to improve your strength so that you can control that range of motion. Your body will feel safer and allow you to use that in games. And then the last one is, hey, no, this is just how you're born. We can't change this. And so if you're that athlete, what we've had a lot of success with, and you'll tend to see athletes do this, if our back leg, if we're on the mound or if we're hitting and we lack internal rotation, we can turn our foot a little bit open. No different than if we're in the weight room squatting. We want them to use the lower half. You see athletes naturally turn their toes out, and that person that lacks hip internal rotation, they're gonna be better off with that toe turned out, heel off the rubber, or a hitter, same thing. If we are somebody who, and he's similar to myself, the ER dominant athlete, you're gonna be the turning the heel and getting it off. If you're the IR, more the pigeon-toed athlete, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. As far as the screening goes, you're then going to potentially be better off turning that foot inwards because you have so much internal rotation that we don't get enough of a stretch, or we don't get enough of our lower half to be in a position to generate that power. Then you might be somebody who would be better off turning that foot in. And so a real quick screen that you can, again, make this even more and just kind of check your work and make it more, I guess, connected to the athlete more. Go ahead and stand up right here, Ryan. So yeah, face the camera. So put your feet all the way together, hands out front. I'm just gonna make, this is not the meanest way to do this, but go ahead and squat as low as you can. He does a pretty good job. He's gonna get to about 90 degrees. He's gonna feel a pinch in the front of his hips. That pinch is telling us, hey, I've run out of range of motion, and because I can't get it from my hips, I'm gonna go elsewhere. He has really good ankle mobility. Go ahead and face me real quick. And you can see that he does a very good job in controlling him having, as far as from a strength standpoint, he can get his knees really far over his toes, and he can get to a pretty good spot. If he were to go lower, go one more and go all the way down, we're gonna see his lower back start to arch, and he's gonna compromise his hip and core positioning to get more range of motion, and he's basically gonna sell out his lower back to be able to get all the way down. We can't get range of motion at one joint. We're either gonna go downstream or upstream. And so for him, go ahead and face the camera again. Feet out a little wider, turn your toes out, so you can go even wider than that. Good, hands out front, we're gonna squat. We've now put his toes turned out. We've bought him more space when it comes to internal rotation. His depth is better. Going to sideways real quick, we can show your core positioning. His core positioning is better, so he's not selling out his lower back. He can get to 90, if not below 90. Feels more comfortable, yes? And so we can allow him to adopt that position, whether it's on the mound or in the batter's box, because it gives him a better job of being able to get into that back hip, that hinge, all the things that we want for our youth players. So you can do it on the table. You can have them laying on the back of their stomach. If you want to check your work and make sure, hey, this is correct. I'm not just going to take Dan's word for it and say, oh, we're going to have all of our hitters do this and all of our pitchers do this. You can check your work from a squatting standpoint, and you're going to find there are going to be some athletes, go and lay on your stomach one more time. There'll be some athletes who feel more comfortable with their feet really close together. What they're going to present on the table is their external rotation is not going to go very far, but their internal rotation is going to go really far out, like excessive. We have some athletes who have 40, 50, 60 degrees of internal rotation, and those tend to be our softball players. And then we do have a baseball component in the baseball population. Those athletes are our IR dominant athletes. Again, Ryan and I are not those athletes, but for those athletes, we're likely need to go the opposite route of our ER dominant athletes. We're going to need to activate. We need to strengthen. We need to go after glutes and hamstrings before they hit, they throw, in their workouts, all the above, because they have so much range of motion when it comes to the hip internal rotation. We need more control and strength at the hip. So there's a ton, I think, that I've hit on right now, and I'm probably talking really, really fast. But hopefully this provides more depth from our webinar. Okay, hey, here's some screens that you can do, and then we'll help connect to our presentation at the ABCA, so that, and then provide a reference for you to come back and dive a little deeper as far as lower half assessments.